Have you ever heard of a place where animals, birds, and even insects refuse to cross, as if an invisible force is holding them back? What if I told you that this boundary isn't marked by mountains, rivers, or fences, but is instead a mysterious, unseen line that divides two completely different worlds? There is a natural barrier that separates the wildlife of Asia from Australia, defying the very rules of evolution. Why do creatures on either side of this line behave as though an invisible wall exists? Come with us as we tell you about this mystery that has baffled scientists for centuries. But before we start, just letting you know that if you love exploring the hidden wonders of our planet, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Together, we'll dive into the secrets of nature that most people have never even heard about. Let's get started. Chapter 1. The Wallace Line. There is an island in Bali across the narrow Lombok Strait. Only 32 kilometers of water separates Bali from Lombok. But in terms of biodiversity, these two islands might as well be worlds apart. This invisible boundary is known as the Wallace Line, and it is one of nature's most puzzling phenomena. The Wallace Line is named after Alfred Russel Wallace. This line represents a division between the fauna of Asia and Australasia. This division is physically negligible, but practically it carries a huge importance. On the western side of the line, you'll find Asian elephants, tigers, and leopards roaming the dense tropical forests. But cross the strait to Lombok and the scene transforms completely. Here, marsupials, cockatoos, and the famous Komodo dragons dominate the landscape. But why does this line exist? The answer lies in millions of years of tectonic activity. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were much lower, Asia and its islands were connected by vast land bridges. Animals migrated freely, establishing a rich and interconnected ecosystem. However, the islands beyond the Wallace Line, like Lombok and others to its east, were isolated from this migration due to deep ocean trenches. These trenches acted as natural barriers and prevented species from spreading further. Over time, this geographical divide became a biological one, creating two distinct ecosystems that evolved independently. Interestingly, this division isn't just about big animals. Even the smallest creatures, like insects and birds, respect this invisible boundary. Bird species from Bali, such as kingfishers and mynas, are strikingly different from those found in Lombok. Marine life too seems to adhere to this divide, with coral reefs on either side showcasing unique species. The Wallace Line isn't just a geographical curiosity, it's a window into the processes that shape life on Earth. It highlights how subtle environmental differences can lead to profound evolutionary changes. For scientists, it works as a living laboratory. It offers insights into the dynamics of adaptation, isolation, and survival. Yet despite decades of research, the line still holds many mysteries. What exactly caused such a dramatic split in biodiversity? Why is this division so pronounced, even in species that can fly or swim? These questions continue to fuel curiosity and exploration, keeping the Wallace Line at the forefront of ecological studies. Chapter 2. Discovery. Alfred Russel Wallace is at the start of the Wallace Line. He was a man whose insatiable curiosity and keen observational skills would forever change the way we see the natural world. Wallace set out on an adventure across the Malay Archipelago in 1854. This area is known for its beautiful wildlife, but is also full of dangers. Wallace set out to find out more about this tropical paradise. He only had notes, collecting jars, and a taste for adventure. Wallace was amazed by a pattern as he went back and forth between the islands of Bali and Lombok. Even though the two islands were close to each other, they were home to very different species. With its lush woods, Bali's ecosystems were a lot like those in mainland Asia. This place was great for elephants, tigers, and hornbills. But Lombok, which was only divided by a small strait, was mostly inhabited by animals that live in Australia, like cockatoos, marsupials, and frilled lizards. This big difference looked almost out of place. What kind of force could split animals into such clear groups over such a short distance? Wallace's discovery was a big deal. He carefully wrote down everything he saw by gathering thousands of specimens and writing down every detail. Through his work, a clear line was found that separated the environments of Asia and Australia. He left a lasting mark on the area of biogeography, and this line was later named after him. Wallace's careful collection of data and clear ideas changed the course of natural science. Scientists had solid proof for the first time of a biogeographical split that was caused by both evolution and geography. Wallace's finding was not only a big deal in the field of science, but it also showed how determined he was. The Malay Archipelago's woods were dangerous because they were full of diseases, bad weather, and few resources. Wallace kept going, though, because he was deeply interested in the secrets of nature. For him, the journey wasn't just about finding new species, it was also about figuring out how they spread. Even more interesting is the fact that Wallace Wallace's observations indirectly backed Darwin's theory of evolution. Wallace came to his own conclusions about natural selection on his own, and his work on the Wallace Line supported the idea that being geographically isolated is a key factor in creating biodiversity. Wallace stayed humble, even though he made a groundbreaking finding. He often said that the natural world was what really amazed him. The Wallace Line is still a great example of how powerful it is to pay attention, be curious, and keep going. It tells us that even small clues, like a bird's song or a butterfly's flight, can help us figure out how diverse our planet is. Chapter 3: Geological Origins. The story of the Wallace Line wouldn't exist without the dramatic geological events that shaped the region millions of years ago. To understand its origins, we must understand Earth's history first. When shifting tectonic plates created the unique geography of Southeast Asia and Australasia, the Malay Archipelago, home to the Wallace Line, is located at the intersection of three major tectonic plates: the Eurasian Plate, the Indo-Australian Plate, and the Pacific Plate. Their movements not only formed the islands we see today, but also established the conditions for the striking biodiversity divide. Millions of years ago, during the Pleistocene epoch, sea levels were significantly lower due to massive ice sheets locking away much of the planet's water. This allowed land bridges to form, connecting the Asian mainland to many islands like Sumatra, Borneo, and Java. These connections enabled species to migrate freely, creating a continuous Asian ecosystem. However, the Lombok Strait, where the Wallace Line is most apparent, remained a deep water barrier even during these low sea levels. This trench is part of the Sunda Shelf. It prevented any significant land connection between Bali and Lombok, isolating species on either side. On the eastern side of the line lies the Sahul Shelf, which once connected Australia, New Guinea, and some eastern Indonesian islands. This landmass was home to a distinctly Australasian ecosystem dominated by marsupials, monotremes, and flightless birds like the cassowary. The lack of a direct connection between the Sunda and Sahul shelves meant that the two ecosystems developed independently, each adapting to its unique environment over millions of years. The geological origins of the Wallace Line are further complicated by the dynamic nature of plate tectonics. Volcanic activity, earthquakes, and the gradual drifting of continents all played a role in shaping the islands and their biodiversity. For instance, the volcanic arcs of the Lesser Sunda Islands, including Lombok, emerged from these tectonic interactions, adding new habitats and further isolating species. Understanding the geological history of the region not only explains the existence of the Wallace Line, but also highlights the incredible power of natural forces in shaping life. The deep ocean trenches and shifting landmasses are more than geological curiosities. They are the architects of the biological divide that continues to wonder scientists and adventurers alike. Chapter 4: Impact on Wildlife. The impact of the Wallace Line on wildlife is nothing short of extraordinary. This invisible boundary has acted as a gatekeeper. It creates two worlds of biodiversity that differ entirely in an opposite manner as day and night. To the west of the line lies a landscape dominated by Asian species, while the east harbors creatures that are unmistakably Australasian. This split has profound implications for how species have evolved, adapted, and survived. On the Asian side, dense tropical forests teem with familiar mammals like tigers, orangutans, and leopards. These species thrive in environments that mimic the ecosystems of mainland Asia, where they share evolutionary histories. Birds such as hornbills and sunbirds add vibrant colors and melodies to the landscape. The presence of these species reflects a long history of connectivity between the Asian mainland and the western islands of the archipelago. Cross the Wallace Line to the eastern islands, and the scene changes dramatically. Here, marsupials like tree kangaroos and cuscuses rule the forests, while cockatoos and lorikeets dominate the skies. These species are more closely related to the wildlife of Australia and New Guinea than to their Asian neighbors. The Komodo dragon, the world's largest lizard, also resides east of the Wallace Line, tells how isolation can lead to the evolution of unique and often giant species. The differences extend beyond large mammals and reptiles. Even among smaller creatures like insects and amphibians, the division is clear. For example, butterfly species that live west of the line look a lot like species that live in India and China, while species that live east of the line look a lot like species that live in Australia. This species split isn't just between animals that live on land. The marine life is also very different. On either side of the line, there are different coral reef communities. The Wallace Line's impact on wildlife isn't just about separation, it's also about adaptation. Isolated populations are forced to adapt to their specific environments, leading to the emergence of species found nowhere else on Earth. This makes the region a hotspot for endemic species and a living laboratory for evolutionary biology. The fact that the Wallace Line is still there shows how fragile ecosystems are. Deforestation and climate change are two things that people do that could make this line less clear by letting exotic species move into new areas. It's not just about protecting biodiversity. biodiversity when you look after the unique animals on both sides of the line, you're also looking after a live example of how nature can change life on its own. Chapter 5. The human exception. For millions of years, nature's rules kept species apart, but humans have crossed this line without caring about the rules, changing the biodiversity and cultural landscape of the area. Early human migration patterns show that humans were very good at getting past geographical barriers. It is thought that early Homo sapiens lived on the islands east of the Wallace Line as early as 50,000 years ago, based on excavations. To do this, they needed to be able to survive and be creative, coming up with simple boats or rafts that could cross dangerous areas like the Lombok Strait. These migrations show how adaptable humans are. Their tools, intelligence, and ability to work together as a society let them get across hurdles that other species couldn't. People who lived on either side of the Wallace Line brought different tools, ways of life, and traditional practices with them. On the western side, which is closer to mainland Asia, farming methods were similar to those in Asia, such as growing rice. In the east, things were different. Native groups like the Papuans were able to adapt to New Guinea and the islands nearby, which were more inaccessible and difficult to live in. These differences in culture are like the differences between plants and animals in the environment. Different societies have evolved separately, just like plants and animals. People today, on the other hand, have not only crossed the Wallace Line, they have also made its ecological borders less clear. Bringing in invasive species like rats, cats, and dogs has had a big effect on the delicate balance of environments. People have brought these animals across the line, either on purpose or by accident, which has upset the local populations on both sides of the line. This has caused the decline or extinction of species that had evolved in isolation for thousands of years. Trade and globalization show that people are still breaking the Wallace Line. In the past, trade paths linked towns across the archipelago, making it easier for people to share goods, ideas, and even plants and animals. Today, ships, planes, and other advanced infrastructure make the Wallace Line unnecessary for people to travel. But this connection is also a threat because it makes it more likely that the environment will get worse and diseases will spread. Even though humans have been able to cross the Wallace Line, it is still a warning of the limitations that other species face. In the same way that it shows how strong people are, it also reminds us that we need to protect the fragile landscapes we so easily damage. Chapter 6. Further discoveries. The Wallace Line isn't just a footnote in the past of natural history, it's still a place where scientists are exploring and learning new things. Since Alfred Russel Wallace first came up with the idea in the 1800s, experts from many fields have added to our knowledge of this enigmatic boundary, learning more about the biodiversity, geology, and evolutionary processes in the area. Genetics has been the site of one of the most important discoveries linked to the Wallace Line. Scientists can now look at the evolutionary relationships between species on both sides of the split through the molecular lens thanks to recent progress in DNA analysis. Genetic studies have shown that many species east of the line, like marsupials and some bird species, share ancestors with Australian animals, while species to the west are closely linked to species from Asia. These results not only back up what Wallace said, but also help us learn more about how genetic separation affects evolution. New findings have shown that the ecosystems in the area are linked in ways that Wallace could not have imagined. Ocean currents and wind patterns, for example, have a big impact on where plant seeds and marine larvae live, which has a small but noticeable effect on the variety of life that lives on islands close to the Wallace Line. Microclimates and local environmental conditions play a part in creating pockets of unique species. This is another area of study that is still being done to find out how life can survive in the worst conditions. The Wallace Line has led people to learn more about the region's history and culture, in addition to its scientific uses. Historians and anthropologists have looked into how native groups on both sides of the line dealt with the unique problems they faced. Their research shows amazing examples of how resilient people can be. For example, they used materials found in the area to make homes, tools, and even boats that could sail across the oceans. In the past few years, conservation measures have also become more important. Protecting the variety of plants and animals on both sides of the Wallace Line has become very important as people continue to change the natural world. To protect the ecosystems for future generations, things like wildlife reserves, protected areas, and eco-friendly tourist programs are being put in place. The Wallace Line is not a fixed relic of the past. It is a frontier of finding that is always changing. Every new discovery in genetics, ecology, or anthropology makes this border even more important as a natural wonder and a sign of the mysteries that will always surround us. As science moves forward, the Wallace Line continues to puzzle and excite, giving us a huge range of options for exploring and learning. Chapter 7. The importance of biogeography. The Wallace Line is very important for biogeography because it is a key part of the study of how life shifts and evolves across physical boundaries. This imaginary boundary isn't just an interesting piece of history, it's an an important idea that helps scientists figure out patterns regarding biodiversity and the complicated processes of evolution. At its core, the Wallace Line shows how species development is affected by being separated from other species. The Asian and Australasian tectonic plates moved apart for millions of years, making deep ocean trenches and other physical hurdles that species couldn't easily cross. Because of this, the plants and animals on either side of the line grew mostly isolated, creating ecosystems that are very different from one another. Scientists can use this sharp split as a natural laboratory to study speciation, the process by which new species form. The Wallace Line also shows how important geographical boundaries are in creating biodiversity hotspots. For instance, the islands of Indonesia, which are on both sides of the line, are some of the biodiverse places on Earth. Part of this variety is because the Wallace Line acts as a filter, only letting certain species spread and do well. Scientists learn more about how ecosystems work and how species connect with each other by looking at these patterns. The Wallace Line also has real-world effects on conservation biology. Researchers can find places that need immediate protection by understanding the biogeographical principles behind the line. For example, places with a lot of endemic species that can't be found anywhere else on Earth, are given extra attention for protection. To keep biodiversity high near the Wallace Line, we need to protect areas, stop the spread of invasive species, and lessen the damage that people do to ecosystems that are already fragile. Scientists are also asked to think outside of the box by the Wallace Line. It has helped us figure out how species live in different places, but it also makes us think about how living things adapt to changes in the world, both in the past and the present. This invisible line is important for biogeography because it tells us about the past and helps us think about how species will survive in a world that is changing quickly. Chapter 8. Mysteries that haven't been solved. The Wallace Line is still a mystery, even after decades of study. Even though it has given science answers, the natural world still leaves them with questions that need to be answered. Because of these questions, the Wallace Line is one of the most interesting topics in biogeography. It's like a puzzle that needs to be solved and explored further. The exact time and process of species separation across the Wallace Line is one of the biggest mysteries that hasn't been solved. Scientists agree that tectonic changes and oceanic barriers played a big role, but they are still finding out more specifics. How did some species get past these hurdles that look like they would never be able to be crossed? It's true that the Wallace Line is a natural split, but some bird species can be found on both sides of it. Did these crossings happen because of unusual weather, or did these species change in ways that made it possible for them to cross open water? Another mystery that hasn't been solved is how human action has changed the biodiversity of the Wallace Line. As early people moved around the area, they probably changed where animals and plants live, but it's still not clear how big of an effect they have. Did people accidentally bring species across the line, changing the way nature works? Or did they act as a second force, speeding up changes that were already happening naturally? The Wallace Line also makes us think about how climate change will affect biodiversity in the area in the long run. Changing weather trends and rising sea levels could change where the line is drawn, making it less clear what it means. Will species on both sides be able to adapt to these changes, or will the chances of them going extinct rise? Scientists are trying to figure out how the Wallace Line might affect the ecosystems that are split by it, but they haven't found the answers yet. Lastly, the Wallace Line brings up some philosophical questions. It represents how little we understand and serves as a warning that nature's complicated things often defy our attempts to classify and explain them. What are some other invisible lines on Earth that separate environments and species that we haven't found yet? The Wallace Line is proof that the natural world is full of shocks and secrets that have yet to be found. The Wallace Line is still talked about in science because of how mysterious it is. This keeps researchers asking questions and studying its depths. Till then, you keep telling in the comments what you heard about the Wallace Line. We might never fully figure out all of its mysteries, but the search for knowledge keeps the spirit of finding alive, which is a fitting way to honor Alfred Russel Wallace's lasting legacy.